Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ian and Nick. Thank you for inviting me to this this gathering to speak. Can everybody hear me in the back?
Not really.
Not really? I'll speak louder.
Just about.
I can project. Maybe we should shut the door.
Yeah.
Well, all I said was thank you so far. I've been coming to the UK quite a lot over the last year or so. Actually more than a year now, for several reasons. One is that there's a group here in the UK, a production company, that's actually making the General Son into a movie, a feature movie. So we've been talking about that a lot. So I've been here quite a lot. We've got a really good script, and been talking to actors and trying to raise money and so on. So anyway, so I've been here a lot for that. And also I've got friends in the Labour Party who for the last 3 years have been inviting me to speak at fringe events at the Labour Party. I don't know if you've heard or not, but it's every time there's some new headline because this, Holocaust-denying anti-Semite Miko Peled is in town. This last, the last conference was in Brighton just 2 weeks ago. And I spoke together with Azam Tamimi, who spoke, I think that's the talk you came to, Nick, in UCL a couple of years ago, and Tom Suarez, who's another great speaker about Palestine. And we were declared to be the most anti-Semitic Holocaust deniers. So there we have it. But anyway, so I've been here quite a lot, so it was quite fortunate when Ian wrote to me.
Did you meet Peter Gregson?
Yes, of course.
He gave us a talk the day he'd been expelled from the GMB union.
Well, there's a strange, well, not really strange if you understand it, but there's a process in the Labour Party. Has anybody here heard about this whole anti-Semitism thing in the Labour Party? So the interesting thing is it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It has to do with the way I see it as an outsider. The establishment of the party not liking Jeremy Corbyn, the Zionist groups in the UK fearful of Jeremy Corbyn becoming prime minister because of his views on Palestine, and so they've been just this horrifying, and the press has not been kind either, and so there's been this insane campaign to call him anti-Semitic, but not only him, but the people who support him. So people have been suspended from Labour. It's madness. It's absolute madness. But anyway, I've had the good fortune to be invited for the last 3 years and see all this unfold. That's a struggle. I think the fear that Israel and the pro-Israeli groups have of Jeremy Corbyn becoming prime minister, and as they see, the last 2 Labour Party conferences have been really like rallies for Palestine. I mean, Palestinian flags and resolutions and so forth. So they're quite afraid, and they're doing everything they can to stop him. So anyway, that's why I've been here quite a bit over the last couple of years. If you don't know my story, I'll tell you briefly. I'm originally, I was born in Jerusalem, to an Israeli Zionist family. As the title of the book suggests, my father was a general in the Israeli army, and the family from which I come, the education that I received, not necessarily just in school or but at home, is about as Zionist and patriotic and Israeli as you could possibly imagine. Has anyone here been to Israel, Palestine? Can I see a show of hands? Oh, okay. All right. Good. If you haven't, you should. What's wrong with you? Those of you that haven't, what are you waiting for? You should definitely go. And incidentally, the name St. Anne is interesting because if you're ever in Jerusalem, in the Old City, one place that is rarely talked about, but one of the most magnificent sites in the Old City is St. Anne's. It's an absolutely magnificent church with a magnificent grounds with archaeology, and anyway, so you should go to St. Anne's. So that's where I grew up. Very, very patriotic. I learned about Zionism, at the dinner table, at home, at family gatherings, because everybody around me, everybody in my family was part of this wonderful movement, but this creation of the State of Israel. I have a grandfather who signed the Declaration of Independence, and a great uncle who was the president, which is of course just a symbolic job, but it's it sounds grand, be the president and so forth. So that's where I grew up. But today I'm here, and over the last quite a few years, I'm traveling around speaking as someone who's rejected Zionism completely, and I speak for Palestinian rights. And I think that the from what I've seen in the world and what I've seen throughout my life, there's really only one reason that we as people, we as humans, make such an enormous shift. And it's usually as a result of a tragedy, something that was so profound, something that was so horrific, that forced us to take a look at what we know is true and question it. And then once we question it, we seek to find out what the truth is. In my case, in 1997, my sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem by Palestinians. And that's exactly the kind of shock, that's exactly the kind of horror that forces you to look at everything you know and question it. Because why would 3 young men kill themselves and kill a whole bunch of innocent people with them? How could we possibly understand it? I don't think we're meant to understand it. And that's exactly the type of, that was exactly the event that forced me to question everything I know and to find out, what is this thing called Palestine and who are these Palestinians? And the subtitle of my book, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, is that journey, going from this life of the privileged occupier, colonizer, where, life is good and the world looks like this, there's electricity and water, you don't even question that. The streets are paved and it's very safe and you don't question any of that. You grow up in a, in a largely European life. And then the journey from that, the journey from that into this other sphere, which is the sphere of,
Sorry for the notes.
So, the journey into the sphere of the occupied, the sphere of the oppressed, the sphere of the other. And the first impression that you get when you make that journey is the enormous difference. Enormous difference. Now, Israelis and Palestinians live very close to each other geographically. But because the segregation is so deep and so successful, we never see each other. And so, certainly growing up in Jerusalem like me, you're never more than 10 minutes away from a Palestinian neighborhood, but this is true for almost every part of the country. As an Israeli, you're never more than a 10-minute drive from a Palestinian community. And the differences are vast. And when I was growing up, there was no wall. There were no checkpoints. There was nothing that stopped people.
Keep going, okay.
There was nothing physical that stopped people from traveling from one side to the other. But we didn't need a wall. Nobody that I knew growing up would even imagine going into a Palestinian town. Nobody in their right mind would walk into a Palestinian neighborhood because it's dangerous and because they're Arabs and because they're different and because they're dangerous. Yeah, they're not rational. You never know what might happen. I mean, they might look nice, but all it takes is one crazy guy. This is the story. So who needs checkpoints and who needs a wall when it's already built in as you grow up? But then taking the journey, you see that there's another side. And the differences were shocking. And the first reaction that I had, and the first reaction that many people have, and even today when people travel throughout the country and they see the two sides, and again, quite often it's right across the street, across the highway from each other, two communities. The reaction, more often than not, is, look what a wonderful job the Jews did. They came and they made this place bloom, and they turned into a modern state, and the highways are wonderful, and the cities are fun, and the restaurants are great, and all of the stuff. And then look at the Arabs. Look how backward they are. Look how dusty and unclean their neighborhoods are. It's obvious. It's obvious. And that's the impression that I had, and in fact I remember hearing this growing up. Look at what we did, and look, they were here, and they just can't get it together. Ours is green and lovely, and theirs is just dusty and dead. If you leave it at that, then that's it. Then that's the story. If you do take the journey, if you do take the time to study what is actually taking place, one of the things that you learn, and it's probably the most shocking thing, is that the biggest difference, the biggest reason we see these differences has to do with water. The Israeli Water Authority, and this is just again one of those things that the journey I noticed, I realized. The Israeli Water Authority controls all of the water over the entire country. It allocates 3% of the water to the Palestinian population, which make up more than 50%. Palestinians are the majority. I call it Palestine, some people can call it Israel, but over the entire country, Palestinians are the majority. The Israeli Water Authority allocates 3% of the water. So what that means is that you're going to have an Israeli town, an Israeli colony that's green and lovely, and nobody even would imagine not using as much water as you would want. Nobody would imagine that. Across the street, across the highway, there's a Palestinian town that gets 12 hours of water per week, of running water per week. So if you have a family and you know that all you're going to get is 10 or 12 hours of water per week, then obviously your priorities are different. If you don't know that, you should. Whoever doesn't know that should do more research. But if you don't know that, then you just see it on the face of it. You see, yeah, wonderful, clean, developed, backward, dusty, dirty. End of the story. But there's a reason to that. There's a reason why you see the Israeli colonies, the settlements, all green and wonderful, and across the street, you'll see the roads are dusty and they're not paved and it's just messy and there's no water. It's that simple. Another thing you'll notice is that on the homes of the Palestinians, there's always a great big black water tank. You never see this in Israeli communities. No Israeli homes have those. We don't need to store water. We get all the water we want whenever we want it. So these are the kinds of things that this journey allowed me to discover, and these are the kinds of things that I try to, talk about, so people understand what this is about, why the issue of Palestine is so severe, is so serious. So anyway, the journey goes on, and I'm still learning, and I'm still doing this. But now I'm at a point where I try to expose as much of this as possible, because the narrative of the wonderful Jews who came to Palestine and turned it into Israel and made it bloom, and that's me. That was my son.
I can't switch mine off because people sometimes want to get here.
Sorry about that. This wonderful narrative of the Jews recovering from the Holocaust after 2,000 years and going to the Holy Land and building, this is very much alive in the minds of many, many people. It's incredible. It astonishes me just how deeply rooted this narrative is. But it's based on a lie. And as someone who comes from that narrative, who was raised with it, who was fed this narrative very early on, I can appreciate how difficult it is to switch from one to the other. What I want to do first, this was just a little preamble, what I really want to do first today is talk about my second book, Injustice. Because the story that I talk about in this book is a story that took place in the United States, but it is characteristic of what has been happening all over Europe as well. And the kind of persecution that Arabs and Muslims have been with which they're faced every single day. And this was a major case in the United States. And it allowed the authorities in the United States to bring down Muslims and Arabs and persecute them today with great ease. Now, the Holy Land Foundation was the largest Muslim relief organization in America. They were doing great work. They were not political. They were a relief organization. They were predominantly working with Palestinians, Palestinian refugee camps, and so forth in Palestine. They were permitted by the Israeli authorities to work there before there was the Palestinian Authority and so forth. So they're perfectly legit, and they were working with other relief organizations, and everything was fine. And they became very successful, and they were highly regarded and highly trusted. But because they were doing such a wonderful job, they began to do something unintentionally which the Zionist watchdogs, and I mean it seriously, Zionist organizations in the United States became very concerned. Because that narrative is the Holy Grail. That narrative is something that the State of Israel and its Zionist groups all over the world guard with their lives. That is the Holy Grail. If you even create a crack in that narrative, then for them it is, I think, a death sentence. So they did this without knowing that this was happening, because they're presenting such a strong case for Palestinians through their relief work. So then throughout the 1990s, all these organizations began publishing articles and books and approaching the Internal Revenue Service and asking to revoke their not-for-profit status, asking all these other relief organizations to stop working with them, with the excuse that they were supporting terrorism, that they were supporting Hamas. Now, after 1995, Hamas was designated a terrorist organization in the United States, so it became illegal to work with them. But there was no proof. So they were fighting this fight the whole time. All these papers and all these terrorism experts came out saying that these guys were working with Hamas and they were sending money to terrorism and so forth, with absolutely no proof. And then there was 9/11. And something that happened, and I mentioned in the book, immediately after 9/11, was that the American government was panicking. They had to show that they were doing something, that they were closing somebody down, that they were seizing assets, particularly seizing assets to show that they're, closing the funding. And there was a sense that there's all this funding going on to terrorist organizations from Americans, from all these innocent Americans. So the sense was, particularly in the U.S. and the Treasury Department, we need to round up the usual suspects and we need to close some people down and to show that something was happening. And George Bush was going to announce something on the 4th of December. So that's just a few months after 9/11. By the 4th of December, they needed to have something. Welcome. You just go.
Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. That's all right. So they were at the top of the suspect list, the usual suspect list. There were Arabs, there were Palestinians, there were Muslims, and they were sending money to Palestine. In other words, perfect targets. And what they did in the Treasury Department, they created new guidelines, which allowed them to close down organizations, designate people and organizations using evidence that would not hold up in a courtroom. In other words, the basis for this of their argument or their claims would not hold in a courtroom. It had to be that simple. So they closed them down. George Bush announced that they had closed down a major terrorist funding network, designated them a terrorist organization, and their assets were frozen, and that was it. So they did what people do in a democracy. They hired lawyers to sue the government because they felt the government acted arbitrarily, which they did. And when I spoke to their lawyers, I spoke to many people, they told me that the most interesting aspect was that these guys were not concerned. They said, we have all our paperwork, we did everything right, this is America, it's a fair justice system. It's natural that the administration, the government is panicking, it'll be fine, we'll do what we're supposed to do. So they sued the government. And they brought an enormous body of evidence to show that they did not only nothing wrong, but they did everything right. They could account for every penny. They could account for every dime, where it came from, where it went, which projects they paid for, everything. The government came with their file, with their evidence, which was made of a few newspaper articles, some documents that were faxed over from Israel, from the Israeli police and the Israeli government, saying that these guys were terrorists or supporters of Hamas. And basically nothing under oath, there was nothing that was notarized, it was all nonsense. The judge dismissed the case and struck all the evidence from the record. So I'm talking to the lawyers in their office, and I'm saying a judge can just do this, dismiss the case and strike all the evidence from the record? I said, well, that's what she did. So then they went to appeal. And the appellate court said, well, perhaps the judge acted, did not act correctly, properly. However, and this however comes up a lot in this case. However, the appellate court said, this is not a normal case. It's a case that involves national security, and therefore they upheld the decision of the judge. As everybody was trying to grapple with this new reality, they heard that a criminal case was being put together, and these guys were indicted. 5 men were indicted. And the lawyers are thinking, indicted for what? There was no crime. They paid their taxes, they can show where the money went. So the American government changed the story, and they said, well, they actually didn't give money to Hamas. They give money to organizations that are controlled by Hamas. Now, the organizations with which they worked in Palestine are well-known, well-regarded relief organizations on the ground. In Arabic, they call them zakat committees. These are organizations that deal with zakat, with charity, with relief organizations. They have board members, they have accountants. These are serious relief organizations. And they said, well, these organizations are controlled by Hamas, and therefore sending them money was a crime. But the U.S. government also works with these organizations. The State Department works with them. The CIA has vetted them and said that it's okay to work with them. Every relief organization that works in Palestine works with these organizations. So saying that they're controlled by Hamas is nonsense. Anyway, they brought experts from Israel, 2 security experts that testified as experts anonymously, which is a violation of the Constitution, because they need to be able to face their accusers, right? But nobody knew who these accusers were. One was said to be an officer in the Israeli military intelligence, and one was said to be an officer in the Shabak, which is the Israeli secret police. And they said that, yes, indeed, these zakat committees are all controlled by Hamas. So in the cross-examination, the lawyers questioned them. So here are the list of these organizations that are listed in the indictment. Do you know their board members? Which of their board members are known to be members of Hamas? They didn't know who they were. Have you been to their offices? They never have. Have you seen their records? No, they never have. Do you know anything about the previous board members? Have you know anything about how they work? No. But they said, we don't need any of that, because we can smell Hamas. And this was said in a court of law. This was taken seriously in a court of law. Anyway, long story short, there was a trial that ended with no convictions. It was a mistrial. The judge announces a mistrial, so then a year later there was a second trial. The second judge allowed pieces of evidence that the first judge did not allow, allowed testimony that the first judge did not allow. 9/11 was brought in, and they start, which is complete no relevance, even if they did give money to Hamas, it's completely irrelevant. And at the end of the second trial, they were all convicted. And I'm going to show you these guys very quickly. I was able to meet, there's 5 of them, I was able to meet 4 of them in prison. The 5th one I was not able to meet for reasons that were never given to me. And look at the prison sentences, okay? Shukri Abu Bakr was the CEO. He was the one that really ran this organization from top to bottom. He received 65 years in federal prison. 65 years. And in the opening statement, when the prosecutor gave his opening statement, he said, well, 1987 was a key year. Why? 1987, Hamas was founded. 1987, the Holy Land Foundation was founded. There you have it. What he left out was in 1987, the first Palestinian uprising, the first Intifada began. And there was an enormous need for relief in Palestine. The other thing he left out was that Shukri had a daughter who was born in 1987, and she was born with several life-threatening diseases. And he was able to avail himself of the good work of charity hospitals that exist in America. And he decided he wants to make that available for Palestinians as well, and that's what drove him to start this organization. 65 years in federal prison. Hassan Elashi, who I was not able to meet, 65 years. He was like the president of the organization. 65 years in federal prison. Mufid al-Qadir he received 20 years. He was not part of the organization at all. He would just show up, go on missions, help raise money, stuff like that. A volunteer. And at the end of the first trial, he was found not guilty on all charges. There were 32 charges. He was found not guilty on all charges. At the end of the trial, the prosecutors polled the jurors, each and every one of the jurors, to make sure they agree. And one of the jurors, who apparently was asleep most of the trial, stood up and said, no, I didn't mean that. That's not what I meant. I made a mistake. It's not true. I disagree that he's not guilty on all charges. So regardless of what the lawyer said, and regardless of what the foreman said, which is that she signed and voted, the judge called a mistrial on him as well, and now he's serving 20 years in federal prison. Now, the interesting story about him is that when the prosecutor made his opening statement, he said family connections are not a reason to convict. We don't convict someone because his family members are criminals. And then they brought terrorism experts to testify that in terrorism cases, family connections are extremely important. Why is it important in this case? Mufid al-Qadr has a brother, and his brother is called Khalid Mash'al. And Khalid Mash'al was the head of Hamas, of the political wing of the Bureau of Hamas for many, many years. He hadn't seen him in decades. And that was the connection. Abdurrahman Ode also had nothing to do with the organization. He would volunteer, he would give money, he donated money, he was just, he would go on missions to help out. And throughout the trial, and even before the trial, they tried to get him to cooperate and collaborate with the authorities. And he kept saying, no. Finally they said, no, fine, you're going to pay for this. And even during the trial, they came up to him and they said, you know what? If you work with us, you can be out in 6 months. 6 months on terrorism charges. But it came with a gag order. So he said, wait a minute, you're going to use my deal against my friends, and I will not be able to speak? No, thank you. 15 years in federal prison. Now, let me tell you something about federal prison. To be a visitor, just to be a visitor, is the most humiliating experience I've ever had. You feel like an ant. Somebody could just step on you and nobody would care. I can't imagine what it's like to be an inmate. And he's sitting there in his, these overalls, and in the visitation room is about this size, and you sit across from each other. The inmates can't get up to go to the bathroom without permission. They have vending machines. The inmates can't go. The guest can go and bring them a snack from the vending machines. That's how humiliating. And he sits there and he says to me, I feel fine. I sleep well at night. I sleep well at night. She says, thank God, I sleep well. 15 years, if you have young children, after 15 years, they're adults. And the final one, Muhammad al-Nazain, he was kind of like the spiritual guy. He was an imam in many mosques. He would preach. He was like the spiritual power behind this organization. And he's kind of the elder of the five, but very strong, very respectable, a very impressive man. Did nothing wrong. Wouldn't dream of doing anything wrong. And all of these five men, they're not just innocent. I met them, I met their families, I visited them in prison several times, which is an enormous process, very difficult process. They're the finest men I've ever met. It's not that they're innocent only. And then, there they are. So then there was an appeal, of course. The appellate court said, well, perhaps there were some mistakes made. Remember the however from the beginning? However, this is not a normal case, and so the sentences were upheld. The Supreme Court in the United States wouldn't take the case, of course. And President Obama, when he left office, was asked to commute their sentences and deport them. And there were several countries that were willing to accept them and give them citizenship. Of course, who wouldn't want them as citizens, right? These are wonderful men. But Obama wouldn't do it. So there we are. They're kind of at the end of. In other words, the judicial process is done. And the problem with this, besides it's a terrible injustice, is that none of this would have happened if they were not Palestinians and Muslims. In other words, they are only in prison because of what is happening in Palestine. That's the connection. And they realize, they say this about themselves, and they understand they are political prisoners, just like the prisoners that Israel holds, thousands and thousands of them in jails in Israel. They are exactly the same, except their prison sentences are usually much longer than most of the prisoners in Palestine. And that is a dangerous connection. And this is happening. This took about 10 years for this case from start to finish. 9 years. Today, they catch young Muslims and throw them into solitary confinement for 30 years, no problem. It goes like this. It's incredible how fast the process is. And there's no recourse. If the government comes and says you're a terrorist, particularly if you have brown skin, and particularly if you're a Muslim and or an Arab, that's it. There's no recourse. There's no recourse. When the book came out, I did a little book tour, and we talked about the civil liberties, the erosion of civil liberties. But the thing is, civil liberties in the West are something that's afforded to white privileged people. In America, blacks, Latinos, Native Americans have no expectation of civil liberties because they've never had them. But when white privileged people like myself, suddenly we see this, we're shocked to go, oh my goodness, civil liberties. But the reality, of course, is that there were never civil liberties for dark-skinned people in the West, but particularly in America, ever. So that's the reality, and that's what this story is about. And when I heard the story for the first time, of course, I couldn't believe it. And when I started talking to other people, nobody believed it. So the one thing that I tried to do, I read over 20,000 pages of legal documents and court transcripts for this book. And I swear to you, I wish I could put all of them in the book. It would be a pretty heavy book. But it'd be worth it. I didn't want people to say, yeah, well, you're some Arab lover and it's your word against the United States government, so why should we believe you? So I put quite a lot of the court documents and the transcripts so people could see the insanity of the arguments against them. The insanity, the stupidity, the ignorance that was taken seriously in a court of law in the United States, and then led to the conviction of these very fine gentlemen. So that's why I wrote this book. That's that book. That's that story. And like I said, the whole thing is about Palestine. I have this thing when I give lectures in America, particularly. I always ask, who's been there? Does anybody know where it is? And is there anybody in the room who couldn't find it on a map? And from time to time, there's an honest soul in the room, and they raise their hand. They admit they can't find it on a map. I mean, it's a very small place. But the problem is that Palestine has been called Palestine and has been Palestine, for thousands of years. I don't know if you've seen. There's a new book called Palestine: 4,000-Year History by Nurit, who teaches it so as. It's an excellent book. It completely puts aside the Zionist biblical narrative and talks about the history. And then one day, in 1948, on the 15th of May, it became Israel. And the problem, again, is that it not only became Israel, but, like my little effects, but that's the kind of fun you have when you do stuff like this. They not only, people talk about two states, they talk about living together, they say something, a lot of people say, oh, I've been to Israel, Palestine. Oh, we're having a talk about Israel, Palestine. You've been to, Israel and Palestine. What's this Israel, Palestine thing? How can a country that's so small have so many names? And they talk about occupied Palestinian territories, and they talk about Israel proper. And I'm going, let's slow down here for a minute. First of all, is it Israel or is it Palestine? Number two, what are occupied Palestinian territories? Are there Palestinian territories that are not occupied somewhere? Because if you say occupied Palestinian territories, people might think that there are some Palestinian territories somewhere that are not occupied. But is that the case? And when we talk about the process that Palestine has gone through over the last 7 decades, the things that come up, they're very, very clear, are that this was the result of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and apartheid regime. Now, these are big words, and when you say these things, anti-Semitism claims come out, and all this kind of nonsense. And my argument is this: look, these are crimes that were defined, very well defined crimes. If you go online, you look for the definition of these crimes, then compare to what has been happening in Palestine for the last 7 decades. Tell me where the differences are. There are no differences. All of these 3 crimes are well defined by international law. Now, it's not that it happened and stopped. It's not that there was a genocide and it stopped. It's not that there was an ethnic cleansing and it stopped. It is an ongoing process that never ended. And in the meantime, what exists in Palestine as a regime, as a state, is an apartheid regime. And that is what the state of Israel is. Now the South Africans called it apartheid, which is an ugly word. The Israelis are smart. The Zionists were much smarter. They said, we're going to call it Israel. How can anybody say anything bad about Israel? It's biblical. It's the Jewish people. How could you possibly say these terrible things about a place called Israel? Now, how do we call it, Israel or Palestine? Well, my take on it is, I invite people to call it Palestine, because if we call it Israel, we are legitimizing these crimes. If we call it Israel, we're legitimizing these crimes. And if we talk to the indigenous people, the native people of Palestine, they call it Palestine. So why would we legitimize this horrible oppression, the settler colonialism, the racism, by calling the country Israel? That, I think, is how we should decide whether or not we call it. Everybody's against us today. That's fine. It's probably some kind of a Zionist conspiracy. We thought they weren't going to come and disrupt. So I think it's very simple. How the name we use to call this country should be based on our values. If we support racism and ethnic cleansing and genocide, then by all means we should call it Israel. And if anybody calls it Israel, they need to own the fact that that's what they're legitimizing. There's no kind, lovely, wonderful, liberal state of Israel. There's no such thing. There never was. You know, when people look at the election results, and Israel has elections every 6 months now, then you see, they say, well, there's been a turn to the right, there's been extremism, it's become so much right-wing. What do you mean? It was founded on a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing in 1948, and expulsions and massacres that are still being uncovered today. How much more to the right can they go? They've always been that way, and it hasn't changed. And that's the reality that I think is important to understand and to accept. You know, you probably heard that there were no Palestinians. Did you hear this thing that Netanyahu's son, who said, how could there be Palestinians? There's no key in Arabic. Do you hear this? Well, there's no J in Hebrew, so how could there be Jews? It's the exact same argument. How could there be a Jerusalem if there's no J in Hebrew? The same kind of argument. Well, so I like to show these pictures. Yeah, that's fine. Anyway, so a point I like to make is to show pre-Israel Palestine. You know, theaters in Jaffa. Jaffa was a major, metropolis with concert halls. You know, a city over 100,000 people with newspapers and a business life and a rich political and cultural life and so forth. The airport, Lid Airport, which preceded Ben Gurion Airport. You know, it was a country thriving with people. And again, I'll recommend again the book by Nurit from SOAS, Palestine, a 4,000-year history. I mean, it's a wonderful historical testament, and probably one of the only books that completely ignores the Zionist biblical narrative. So it's worth reading just for that. You know, normally when people talk about Palestine and they talk about the oppression, the occupation, they talk about the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Well, there is no more West Bank, really. It was a piece of land that Israel defined as the West Bank and then took it and integrated it. But I like to talk about other parts of the country as well. So the Negev Desert, for example. The Negev Desert makes up almost half of the country. Okay? In the Negev Desert, there still live about 200,000 indigenous Palestinian Bedouin. They're Israeli citizens. Half of them live in towns that are called unrecognized towns. Why are they unrecognized? Because they preceded the state. They existed before Israel was established, and they refused to be relocated. They refused to move. So they get no services, no water, no electricity, no road, no health services. They just allowed some of them to build schools. For them to get water, they have to walk, and they pay inflated prices for water because they're not on the grid. The water, electricity, anything. If there's an emergency and you need to call an ambulance, there's no road. Now, these are Israeli citizens, you know. The other 100,000 that were relocated and now live in what can only be described as townships, the poverty, the unemployment. Now, they're forbidden from working in agriculture, even though agriculture is their main source of income, used to be. Right next to these townships that were built for them, you have Israeli colonies that were built. Israeli towns, kibbutzim, farms, and so on, that are thriving. The Negev Desert is a very fertile desert, which is why in 1948 and throughout the early 50s, they kicked out as many of the native Palestinians as they could because they wanted the land. It's a very fertile desert. It has compared to desert, it's got a lot of water. It is beyond belief, and these are Israeli citizens. So the problems of Palestine are the problems of Palestinians everywhere, and Palestinians exist throughout the entire country. Focusing on only the West Bank and Gaza leaves out a great deal of the story, I believe. So that's one part. There's you may have heard there's one particular village in Negev called Al-Araqib. Al-Araqib was destroyed some 150 times. I mean, there's nothing left except a cemetery and a few tents, and still the bulldozers come and the Israeli come and destroy them. The Sheikh, and these are, by the way, British friends of mine, they're members of Labour. Sheikh Sayyar refused to move. The government offered him money, they wanted to buy his land. He said, no, I don't want to sell my land. So he said, well, in that case, you're trespassing. And it's been this crazy cycle. He just came out of prison. He was in jail for about a year now because of trespassing. But he was released with a restraining order saying he cannot go back to his home because his home is state land. He's not allowed to trespass. It's that kind of an absurd reality that they live in, you know. And again, these are Israeli citizens. Has everybody here heard of the story of Ahat Tamimi? So the story of Ahat Tamimi became famous because of the way she looks, because of the story of her family and her village. To me, this story was personal because her father is a very good friend of mine and we've been friends for a very long time. But it's indicative of what is happening. It brought to light, I think, what has been happening to Palestinian children for decades. The arrest, the detention, the torture that they go through. It's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. And when both she and her mother were arrested, and I don't know if you saw the video clip of how she was arrested or why, but their village and their home is invaded by soldiers week after week after week after week. Over 20 members of her family were killed over the years. And she's only 18. All right, it's been going on for years. And at one point there was the soldiers were there and they were coming into their front yard. And she and her cousin started pushing them out. Now these are armed, fully armed. There were 3 soldiers there, an officer and 2 soldiers, fully armed. And there was a little altercation that started, and then she slapped the officer. And that slap was really a slap that was heard around the world. And in Israel, there was pressure because the soldier did not react. Israelis are used to seeing Palestinian men, women, children, at the end of any altercation, on the ground bleeding to death. Suddenly, nothing happened. And all the big talk shows, and all the newscasters, and all the great journalists, the most liberal journalists, said, how could he have acted like this? I would not have had the kind of discipline that he had. Another journalist said he should have taken him out. They should go back there and take her out into a dark place where there are no cameras and deal with her. I mean, it's insane, the kind of stuff that was going on.
Sorry, can I just add, wasn't that a week or 2 after one of her cousins?
Yeah, it was a week later, yeah.
Shot?
Yeah, one of her cousins was shot there, yeah. So then, 48 hours later, there was so much pressure, the army came back, arrested her and her mother at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then, of course, you're thrown in a jeep, no lawyer, no parent, no adult present, parent, sleep deprivation, water deprivation, no bathroom breaks, hours and hours of interrogation, that sort of thing. And so that really brought to light for a lot of people what goes on with Palestinian children. Both she and her mother said the only reason she got the attention is because, the way her mother said it, is because she looks like them. That's why the world is paying attention, because she looks like them.
And the diagnosis driving me insane as well.
Well, we've got an issue with the temperature, and so we're going to have to kind of deal with a little heat and a little noise. Let's be a little zen about this. We just have to be a little zen about this. There we go. There we go. It's all about compromise.
Well, I thought Israel was the only democracy in the Middle East.
It is if you're a Jew. Israel, and that's the confusing part, because Israel is a democracy if you're me. If you're an Israeli Jew, it is a democracy. The problem is that Israel governs, the majority of the people that Israel governs are not Israeli Jews, so they don't participate. I'll talk about that in a second. This is another, you've probably heard of Hebron and what happened in Hebron. It's the old city of Hebron is governed by a few hundred lunatic, right-wing, violent gangs, Israeli gangs. which are called settlers. Yeah, we call them settlers. All Israelis are settlers. You know, it's funny. They say these are settlers. You know, are there any Israelis that are not
legitimises them,
settlers?
doesn't it?
Huh?
Using that term legitimises them.
Well, using the term does, it legitimizes some Israelis. So, for example, Israelis who live in Tel Aviv, or Israelis like me that live in West Jerusalem, you know, we're not settlers. They're the settlers. These crazies. We have nothing to do with them. But excuse me, how did we get there? Because all of Israeli towns and cities and villages are illegal settlements. That's another interesting term, illegal settlements. Are there some illegal settlements that are part of that over there? What makes them legal? If they happened 20 years before and 20 years after that, they're all illegal. All Israelis are settlers. It's a big lie to assume that somehow if we live in Tel Aviv, we're not settlers because we're poor. It's nonsense. They're all settlers. But these guys are particularly violent. And then these guys really are they're like the shock troops, if you will. They're like the leaders who go in and do the dirty work, and then the state comes in and legitimizes it. So there's still Palestinians in Hebron, so this is still going on. But it's insane. You know, there was a massacre there in 1994 in the Ibrahimi Mosque, right? Mm-hmm. So they closed down the main thoroughfare for Palestinians. This shop, Shahada Street. And there's a campaign, Open Shahada Street, every year. You guys should look it up, you know, when it comes up. But they closed it down. Now, when you read the order, in a small print, it said it's closed down to vehicles unless they're registered in Israel. Which means the settler vehicles, because they're Israelis, they're registered in Israel, are permitted. Only Palestinians are not permitted. It's an absolutely insane reality. And it goes on every single day, all the time, and with no consequence at all. Israel just kicked out several groups of what they call, what do they call them? They're observers. They're observer groups. They're parts of churches, or parts of these organizations, and they would go to Hebron and other parts of Palestine just to observe and kind of keep the settlers at bay and the soldiers at bay. So Israel kicked them out.
Ecumenical.
So some of them were ecumenical, exactly. So the Palestinians in Hebron, this wonderful group called Youth Against Settlements, you may have heard of them, decided they were going to be the observers. So they made these wonderful vests, Hebrew, English, and Arabic. And now these kids who go to school see their brothers and fathers and uncles standing, observing, making sure that they're okay. And the settlers went wild. They went insane. If you see the videos of how the settlers are trying to attack these observers. But number one, I think it was an ingenious move for them to become their own observers. But this is, again, it's an absurd reality where kids have to need observers to go to school because the settlers and the soldiers, or these gangsters and soldiers, are threatening them. You know? What else? So I have to say, I promised somebody I was going to bring some buttons, and I left them in my hotel room, and I forgot the BDS buttons. Otherwise, I'd be tossing them at you already. But I'm going to be in London for a while, so maybe we can meet later, and I can bring the bag. But anyway, the question that people always ask is, what can we do? I mean, how do we help? And Palestinians gave us the answer. They gave us the answer. They gave us a gift. They said, here is what you can do. Here's what we, the Palestinians, who are living under this oppressive regime, who are suffering every single day from this horrifying monster that the West created in Palestine called Israel, here's what we need you to do. It has nothing to do with violence. It has nothing to do with racism. It has nothing to do with hurting anyone. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Which, of course, today, these three letters spell anti-Semitism, in case you didn't know. And in Israel today, by the Israeli authorities, by the press, these three letters are the most hated letters in the world. If they could, they would take, I think, these letters out of every single word, every single billboard. They're so feared and they're so scared. And in America, too, and here, too. I had a meeting with, last year at the labor conference, I had a meeting, it just turned out to have a meeting with an MP, and I showed up like this. You think he saw a vampire? He was like this. No, I disagree. It was panic-stricken, the fear of this. So let's look at the demands of this call. What are they asking for? What are the demands of the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions? It's really quite simple. It boils down to justice, freedom, and equality. Ending the military occupation where it exists, allowing the refugees to return, and equality between Israelis like myself, and Palestinians, which doesn't exist. Even Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship do not enjoy the same rights as I do, as an Israeli citizen. Where's the anti-Semitism? Does somebody want to point out the anti-Semitism? Justice, freedom, equality. This somehow contravenes Jewish tradition, Jewish law. It does, it contradicts Jewish. Where's the anti-Semitism here? It's all remedial. It's all about creating a remedy or offering a remedy for the Palestinians who suffered from the creation of Israeli occupation and so forth.
Real anti-Semitism.
So exactly. So where is the problem? But it's out there. BDS is anti-Semitism. BDS is this. BDS is that. But it's complete nonsense. And it not only is the right thing to do, it gives all of us an opportunity to participate in the resistance. It's a form of resistance that is dedicated, principled, non-violent, that worked, that has a track record. In South Africa, when I was in South Africa, everybody I met told me BDS helped us get rid of apartheid. That's the model. So it gives all of us an opportunity, not just to show solidarity. Solidarity is great, but not when somebody is bleeding to death. Palestine is bleeding to death rapidly. Standing there with a Free Palestine t-shirt and saying, yeah, go, 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 it's not going to do anything. What's needed is action. What's needed is immediate, urgent action. And that's what BDS allows for. That's exactly what BDS allows for. So it's a crucial part. And again, Palestinians have told us what they need us to do, which is quite rare, but it's a good thing. And so I encourage it and support it and suggest that you do as well. And see how you can participate. Is there hope? So here's the thing with hope. We all sit here, rich, free, and alive, all at the same time. And for us to say, well, it's hopeless, there's nothing we can do, we don't have that luxury. We do not have that luxury. We are, all of us, bound to do something, to find hope and then fight for it. We can't sit here as we are and say, well, there's no hope, there's nothing we can do, it's been going on for thousands of years, that's the end of the story. We can't do that. We have a responsibility to act. We have a responsibility to find the hope and then do everything we can to see that hope materialize. And what does hope look like? So one option is what exists there today, which is racism and violence. If you look at the results of the Israeli elections, by the way, which 5 million Palestinians who live under Israeli rule did not participate in these elections, and their lives will be affected by if there is ever a government, by the government. 3 million people in the Gaza Strip, 2 million people in the Gaza Strip, 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank had nothing to do with this. They did not participate. Their lives are affected by the Israeli government. The only Palestinians who did participate are a small group of Palestinians who actually have Israeli citizenship. And by the way, what's interesting about that is the only thing that remains from the pre-1967 Israel. Because when Israel was established, some of the Palestinians that remained received some kind of a citizenship. It's a quasi-citizenship, but never mind. Okay? They live in a particular part of the country, in the pre-1967 borders. After 1967, Israel took on the rest of Palestine, and all these other Palestinians never received citizenship. Now, Israelis live everywhere. Israelis live over the entire country. There's no West Bank or anything. Israelis live anywhere they want. And they vote, and they're citizens just like, the full citizens. Palestinians are only citizens if they live in the pre-1967 borders. That's really the only remnant that's left from that, what Israel was like, before 1967. So racism and violence is the reality today, regardless of who becomes prime minister, by the way, which one of the parties ends up forming the government. That's the reality. But there is another possibility, right? Freedom, justice, equality, the same demands, the same things that BDS called, the demands for BDS called for, can be a reality. And that's where hope is. A real democracy with equal rights is exactly where hope lies for Palestine. Which means it goes back to being Palestine, which is a this is a graphic that scares a lot of people because Israel is erased. But it goes back to being Palestine, and it's a free, democratic Palestine with equal rights. So the question that I get from time to time is, well, where are the Jews supposed to go? And my response is, why do you think the Jews have to go anywhere? This notion that only one side can have rights, and it has to be at the expense of the other. If they had rights, well, they would wipe us out. Only one side can have rights in Palestine. If everybody has rights, it's never going to work. It's complete nonsense. Israel is a regime. It's an apartheid regime. It's violent, it's brutal, it's wrong. And as a regime, that's exactly what we're talking about. Nobody talks about the people. You know, there's the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews as a community have always opposed the state of Israel and opposed Zionism. And they have this banner that they bring to protest and this mantra that they say, they call for the peaceful dismantlement of the Zionist state. The peaceful dismantlement of Israel and the creation of a real democracy with equal rights for all people. The majority of whom right now, like I said, are actually Palestinians. And the last little slide that I have for you tonight is this one. So I took this picture at a refugee camp not far from Palestine. And you see the wonderful smiles on these kids and they're horsing around. I promise you, if anyone in this room set foot in that refugee camp, they would not be smiling. It is the most horrifying conditions you could possibly imagine. Horrifying conditions. No running water, no electricity, no heating and it's freezing cold, of course, in the winter. So there's no cooling in the summer, no heating in the winter, no medical care at all, no healthcare facilities at all. Sewage in the streets, houses made of mud, poverty to a point that it's beyond belief. They take the dry bread and add a little water to make it soft so they can eat. I'm telling you, 5 minutes in that environment, everybody in this room would be in tears. Look at the smiles on these kids. Now, the only reason these children live in those conditions is because they've been banned from returning home. Their homes are a 2-hour drive, maybe a 3-hour drive from this refugee camp. There's no reason why they should not be allowed to return, other than the fact that Israel doesn't want them. There's plenty of water, plenty of electricity, plenty of privilege that Palestinians can enjoy, just like I do when I'm there. But they've been banned, so they have to live in this horrifying, horrid reality, which is inexcusable and unjustifiable. Now, what's a free Palestine? We talk about a free Palestine. We have the Free Palestine shirts and stickers and Free Palestine everything. What's a free Palestine? Unless we understand and we internalize what that term means, it's meaningless. Unless we know exactly what we're fighting for, it's meaningless. And Palestinians, by the way, know very well what this means. Palestine is a well-defined country, from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean, from the Lebanese border all the way down to the Negev Desert. It's a well-defined, clear place. It has to be free. It has to be free of oppression. It has to be free of racism. It has to be free of violence. It has to have equal. Everyone who lives there should enjoy the same rights. That's what a free Palestine looks like. And that's what a free Palestine, I believe, should be. And I believe it can be. But all of us are going to have to go to work, and we're going to have to do it quickly. And if we do, then this free Palestine will be our reality. And I believe it could be a reality much sooner than most people think. Thank you.